Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third SALTISE 2021 Keynote event. My name is Chris Whitaker. I teach physics at Dawson College, and I'm the co-coordinator of the Dawson Active Learning community. I've also been involved with SALTISE as a collaborator, executive member, and friend since the very beginning. And just before we get going, a quick note about how to run this session. So during Dr. Freeman's talk, you have access to both a chat and a Q&A. The chat is a place where you can exchange with each other. Scott will be asking you to put some things into the chat in an interactive fashion, and he'll be looking at the chat. But for questions that you want to ask or have asked of Scott at the end of the session, please put those into the Q&A. Note that you can vote up questions in the Q&A, and that'll just help me decide what questions to bring to Scott's attention at the very end. So for the interactive stuff during the session, please use the chat. For questions towards the end of the session, please put those into the Q&A. So we're very happy to have Dr. Scott Freeman with us today. And before I formally introduce him, I want to note that it's not often that you can point to an academic paper that marks a clear-cut transition from a time before to a time after. And yet in 2014 that happened, at least it did for me. So before 2014, when promoting or defending active learning as an evidence-based pedagogical set of practices that improve teaching and learning, I had to refer to key studies from a mountain of evidence that had been growing under our feet since the 1990s and the 2000s. But there was no mic drop moment. No moment when you could clearly say, well, that debate's over. Well, in 2014, our guest was the lead author on just such a paper, a mic drop paper that gathered the overwhelming evidence into one source, a meta-analysis of 225 studies that clearly showed active learning was more effective than traditional lecture-based teacher-centered pedagogies. Scott Freeman grew up in Wisconsin and received a BA in biology from Carleton College in 1978. After working in environmental education and international conservation for 6 years, he did graduate work at the University of Washington on the molecular systematics and morphological evolution of blackbirds, and he received a PhD in zoology in 1991. He did a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University and then returned to the University of Washington as the director of public programs at the Burke Museum. And since the 1990s, his focus has been on textbook writing, teaching, and discipline-based education research. His talk today will focus on the recent work that he and his team have been doing about trying to make education a gateway to social equity instead of a gatekeeper that functions as a bastion of privilege. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Scott Freeman.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for everybody being here. Good afternoon. And let's plunge right in. We're going to get into the theme that Chris mentioned, which is really digging into the issue of equity in higher education. Okay, so here we are. So I'm going to bring my chat up so you guys can tell me what you're thinking as we go along. Give me just a second. There we go. Great. All right, so there's the title, Evidence-Based for Inclusive Teaching in Undergraduate STEM Majors. For those of you who teach out of STEM, just bear with me. This is, most of the data are I'm going to show you about science, technology, engineering, and math. And one of the questions we'll end with at the end of the talk is, do these patterns we're going to go through today together travel to the humanities and social sciences? That's an open question right now. Okay, so let's see. 3 questions for today that we'll be addressing. First is to you, to look in the mirror and just ask yourself, why do I get up in the morning? Why do I do this job? I want to give you some things to think about and hopefully some inspiration. And then we're going to look at some data that Chris just referred to a second ago about the impact of active learning, sort of the SALTISE mission statement on all students in your classrooms. And then we're going to get to probably the most urgent questions a lot of us are thinking about as higher educators is, can these new approaches, evidence-based approaches to teaching, help students from who've traditionally been excluded from the benefits of higher education. Okay, so just how important is your work? I'm going to start with this statement. Colleges and universities need to make evidence-based decisions about teaching. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a radical statement. It shouldn't be. We're scholars. We're supposed to be evidence-based people. But when it comes to teaching, the fact is, I'm going to be showing you, by the way, if you follow my cursor, I'm going to be showing you citations in the lower right here. And this work was published just about 3 years ago, documenting that at least in STEM courses, this statement, most faculty's teaching by the lecture, is correct. So that's discouraging to me, and I hope most of you, but let's dig into why. So use your chat, please, and tell me, anybody recognize this guy I'm highlighting with my cursor here? Who is this? Yes, Konrad Lorenz, co-winner of the Nobel Prize for pioneering work in animal behavior. Who can tell me via the chat, what are these birds? And what are they doing? Yeah, they're gray-legged geese, and they have been imprinted actually on Dr. Lorenz's boots. So this is a form of probably the most basic form of learning that's ever been documented in animals. So tell me, what does that little story have to do with the why question? Why are people still lecturing? Yeah, we follow what was done before. We are imprinted. At least our generation of instructors are imprinted on learning. That's what worked for us. And I hear this over and over and over. So of course our students must be just like us, or if they're not, they should be. So they should learn via lecture. All right, so that's where we're starting. And you have to appreciate, this has been going, the European form of university started in Paris and Bologna in about 1050. This is an illuminated manuscript from 1350 from the University of Bologna. And this gentleman I'm highlighting here apparently is named Henry of Germany. Who can recognize what is he doing here? I'm going to keep your fingers busy in the chat. Yeah, he's lecturing. He's actually reading from a text, and his students are following along. And we've made a lot of progress in the last 800 years because now we read from PowerPoint slides, and our students follow along with the PowerPoint slides we've handily put up on the web for them. And when you dig a little deeper, you realize, wow, not that much has changed at all. The students in the back pews in this case, or rows in our classrooms, are sleeping or chatting or texting. So this has been going on for a while. And if you look at these statements, I've dug from, several of these came from faculty meetings I was sitting in, and I wrote down, so if you just read through these as I highlight them, some others came from the literature. These are getting a little dated, but I could find equivalent stuff in more recent. You read through these, what do you notice about these statements? And as you're typing in or thinking about this question, about the pattern in these statements, I want to let you know that these came from some absolutely world-class scientists. Yep, you guys have got it. You're just nailing it. Look at the chat. You guys just going crazy. And you look at it. I'm just going to highlight exactly what you saw. No data, but we're going to say things anyway. And you guys, this is so critical. I mean, we were chatting. The organizers in the panel were chatting prior to the talk starting, and we're in an international crisis of making non-evidence-based decisions. And when we do this in our own classrooms, we're just an extension of what's going on all over the world. And it is a crisis of our time. And again, we can start to address it in our classrooms by you guys are the advocates for evidence-based teaching. And I just want to walk through this with you to just really just try to fire you up for how important it is. The ramifications are global. So second is the issue of becoming more inclusive. So I want to show you some data slides here. These are all from Canada. This one is a little dated, but tell me how you read this graph. So this is parental income quartile along the horizontal axis. This is university participation rate for 19-year-olds. Higher ed still very wealth dependent. Wealthier family more likely to do university. Exactly. I actually saw these in an American. I saw these and said, wow, Canada's doing way better than we are. In the US, this number for the upper income quartile is at almost 90%. In the bottom, this number in the US is about 13%. It's absolutely crushing, but you're facing a lot of the same issues that we are in the States. Okay, so next graph I want to show you is, this is, let's unpack it. This is now quintiles instead of family quartiles. This is income quintiles. So we've got 5 groups. This is looking at 215 constant dollars for how much are your graduates from university earning 5 years on average, earning 5 years after graduation based on the circumstances of their birth. So what are you guys seeing here in these data? This is something I learned early in doing active learning. When I pose a question to my students, I'll wait minutes. Thank you, guys. What about debt? We're going to get to that. Pick your parents. It's worth to go to university no matter what your parents earn. Yeah. And this is actually, if you break this down, this report that came out of Statistics Canada, here's the bump with a high school degree versus a university degree for students from the upper quintile, 86% more, over $30,000 a year. But that bump, it's about the same increment, about a little over $30,000. But if you start at 20,000, where high school graduates are, if you're from the bottom quintile, that's an enormous leap. So the increment that your lowest income students are getting down the road in terms of their income power is extremely important. You are reducing disparities if you're helping these students get a university degree. Okay, so another aspect of equity is just access. And I hope you all take great pride in these data showing. This is a little misleading. Before 1961, it was only full-time students. So that's partly why this is so low, but this is undeniable. As a society, Canada has democratized access to higher education. And so really exciting accomplishment. And then I wanted to ask you, you're probably aware because you see it in your classrooms all the time, but if you had to pick this number, what would you guess it is? Someone says 65%, 60%. Yeah, just under 60, 55 to 60. And again, the ramifications of this are huge. We as instructors are educating for the first time in human history, now almost 2 generations, where women are the better educated gender. And speaking of women and men as binary gender for our purposes today. All right, some folks in the chat said, what about debt? What about tuition? Let's look at those data. This is the percent of government funding of the total cost of higher education since the 1920s. And you can see the trend over the past couple of decades. I'm sure you're all painfully aware of that fact. And how would you fill in the red question marks here in this statement? Someone asked in the chat about, is this US? All the data I'm showing are Canada. Yeah, 50%, it's fallen by almost half. And tuition has responded. Anybody have a guess at what this question mark would fill in terms of students so real terms, that's inflation adjusted. How much more are students paying in tuition since the 1990s? Yeah, people are saying 3 times 50%, it's about 2.7. Yep. And again, on the US side, down south here, the situation's even worse. Okay, and of course, the issue that someone brought up earlier in the chat is debt. This is an average debt among students, Canadian students coming out of university. So again, if you can just guess, how would you fill in these red question marks? 25,000, by the way, is by economists consider that heavily indented. And right now it's 20%. People are guessing as much as 50%, but that 50% of grads are coming out with at least some debt. That 20% is heavily indebted and it's growing steadily. So again, I'm telling you things you already know, but it's good to know the numbers and see the data. On the other hand, some folks in the chat have commented, yeah, but look at the difference in earning potential. We're going to move right along here. So this question mark is actually 63% on average. So if you work that out, even $20,000 a year as a conservative estimate for how much a university graduate 4-year degree is earning over a high school degree, lifetime, what kind of number would you tell your students their earning potential if they get a 4-year degree? How much more money will they make on average individually? Yeah, first order, someone typed in $1 million, really close. Yep. And if you've got a lifetime partnership with 2 university graduates, you're talking about close to $2 million over a lifetime. So the ramifications intergenerationally are enormous. So again, how important are your work, you guys? It's huge, absolutely huge. We've democratized access. We need to democratize success. We need to do something about cost. And that, again, is an international problem. But I don't know if we'll get to this in the Q&A, Chris can monitor, but I'm proposing that the kind of work we do in active learning, you and I do, can help with cost, and maybe we'll get to that. All right, second question for today, active learning and the overall impact on students in STEM. I want to start with my personal story. It may mirror parts of yours, so to unpack these data a little bit, I'm going to show you data. This is how I got started in collecting data on student performance and student success. I started out, first time I was teaching introductory biology. These are large enrollment courses in 2002, 3, 5. I had about 350 students in the lecture hall. Up here after the economic crisis in 08, our enrollments went nuts. And I had 700 students in a room at a time in fall of 09. So enrollments were large and then extremely large as you look. During these 6 quarters, I was the sole instructor. So when you do this work and you're looking at student outcomes, you need to control for the instructor. You need to control for the preparation of the students. So we usually use either their current college GPA or their college entrance exam scores, or sometimes their high school grade point average, to control for that. And we've shown that students are statistically equivalent when we looked at them across time, same course. And then you also have to look at exam difficulty, or because we're going to be looking at failure rates there, and that's exam points in this course explain almost all the grades and failure rate. So I was looking at 2 metrics of failure here. So at my university, we grade on a 4-point scale with decimals. So students can get a 1.7, a 3.2, or so forth. If you get less than a 1.5, so on a DF or a A through F grading system, that's a C minus, D plus, you can't go on in biology. You have failed. And by the way, back then, these were mostly sophomores. So these were not first fall freshmen just figuring out how to do university. These were experienced college students who should have been able to navigate how higher education works. If you got less than a 2.5, a C plus, B minus, the the department might not let you major. You had to do better in subsequent courses for them to let you major. So these were huge criteria. When I started out teaching, I lectured because, of course, like Conrad Lorenz, it worked for me. I was imprinted. And these failure rates, this doesn't include withdrawals. It's over 20%. And statistically, by the way, there's no difference between these numbers. These 2 years are equivalent. So this, I consider this a disaster. And just as an aside, I was getting really strong student evaluations because I would learn student names, and you know, I had open office hours, and I don't know, they thought I was funny or something, but so I got high student evaluations. So I was getting great feedback from my dean, and my chair thought, Scott, oh, you're doing such a great job. Wow, look at these evaluation numbers. And I was in the bathroom throwing up because I was looking at these failure rate data thinking, what in God's name is wrong with me? I've got fantastic students and they're flailing here. So I started looking at the literature and doing the kind of work you guys have been doing in SALTISE. And I created what back then I called a medium structure course. This is the first time, 2005 was the first time we had clickers that you could use in a large, the technology had come along. We could use personal response devices, handheld back then. Then I was also using we could use the web to do practice exams. We give short answer exams at my university in this course. And we got the first significant drop in the failure rate in the history of the course. So we published a paper about this, and I started giving talks. And I was telling people back then, I said, you know, if we ever I'm going to keep working on this course, and if I ever get it down below 10%, I said, I can die happy. And so I kept working on the course. And so now I'm ready to go. So what I did here, I call it high structure. People will call it flipping now. But basically, instead of lecturing, saying, okay, you guys, here's the information, go home and figure it out. And get ready for these really tough questions I'm going to ask you on exams, but don't expect help from me, which is what I was doing in 2002, 2003. By here, the students had to come to the class prepared. We gave them reading quizzes. They had the basic vocabulary. We gave them exam practice, and then they had a formal practice exam afterwards. That's why I call it high structure. You're actually structuring the learning experience very closely for the students. So, and this is an important for you guys, point for you guys when you're selling this on your campus and to your colleagues elsewhere, is that all students benefit, but sometimes you'll come back, and especially with more traditional faculty, they'll say, oh, but it's only for the struggling students and they're struggling anyway. Everybody is benefiting, and even the stellar students are doing better. That's a really important point to make. Okay, so that was my course, intro bio, one campus, one student population. And then, as Chris said, my group dug in and said, well, what's going on in the rest of the world and the rest of science, technology, engineering, math? So we looked at every paper we could find, starting in the first one we found with data that we could use was 1942. And we looked at, let's see, by then it was almost 50 years of data. We used traditional lecturing and any form of active learning. And I'll tell you, back then, we'd look at some of these papers and go, oh my goodness, really? You call this an active learning intervention? But it went in the bin. People were trying something. And it had to be in a course. It wasn't a sort of outside of course experiment that went on. And it had to be the class sessions themselves with the instructor of record, and as opposed to labs or extra supplemental instruction section. Again, it was STEM. And you had to have data on student performance because back when we were working on this, a lot of people would just report data and say, oh, my students really liked it, or they thought they learned more. We had to have exam data or concept inventory data or failure rate data. What's happening with grades. And with the exams, by the way, they had to be, we tossed out a lot of papers where they couldn't show us objectively that the exams were equivalent. We were just really black and white about that criteria. The exams had to be just as harder in the active learning instance. Okay, so here's some more data for you guys to look at. If you look at failure rates, the standard is in the literature is to report an odds ratio, which is 1.94 in terms of the odds of failing in a lecture environment versus active learning. I want you guys to look at, we reported in the paper that Chris referred to in 2014, we reported these 4 sorts of ways to read this number. So on average, the failure rate across all these courses, I think there was, I'm forgetting now, I'll show you in a second, 67 or something papers, 12% difference on average in failure, where it was 55, that's a 55% higher failure rate in lecturing. Another way you can state the same number is that a student in a lecture in the same course with the same instructor is 1.5 times more likely to fail. These are biomedical randomized control trials, and there's a, in that literature, there's a consensus that you can stop the study for benefit. So just quickly, here, if you say, if your protocol says we're going to enroll 5,000 patients in this study to test this new drug, if you get these numbers on relative risk as you start to collect people go through the trial, and if your p-value on a significant difference for your outcome, in this case failing or not, or passing the course, is less than 0.001, then people say stop the trial. You don't need to do it on 5,000 people. We know it works. The numbers on active learning just blew this out of the water. So if this were a medical trial, we would have stopped for benefit a long time ago. And then these are the implications for tuition. So of those 4, just if you would type into the chat, which is most meaningful to you? Like, which would you pick to tell somebody about? A lot of people are saying risk ratio, the 1.5 times. That's why I put it in red, because we heard that back a fair amount. Some people really like the biomedical thing, and people were saying, use the phrase educational malpractice. In fact, for those of you who teach physics, there's a paper in the physics ed literature that actually suggests, they're talking about gender inequities. They're actually suggesting that this is American data, and they said, just tossing out that women might be able to sue their universities on the basis of the Civil Rights Act, which is one way to make changes to get personal injury attorneys involved. Yeah, so thanks you guys for the ideas in the chat. That's so this is how the data break down by discipline that were in the study. These are the means by discipline. This is that grand mean of 12% difference. The total of 67 studies. For those of you who are working in geology, we need more data. I showed this slide at a geology educators conference with about 500 people in the room, and the room got really quiet. It was like, dang, we need to get to work. But the general message here is that it seems to be robust across disciplines. Okay, with exam scores, and we'll go a little quickly here, similar graph showing what's going on by discipline. We were able to dig out 158 papers with exam score data and showed that the overall effect is about half a standard deviation. And that translates, these are again, how do you make that number real to people? These are 2 ways to translate that number. And Liz is just reminding people, sorry if you haven't seen this before in the chat, if you're sending to both panelists and attendees, then everyone can see your comment. Thanks, Liz. And sorry, someone in the chat just mentioned the tuition saving. That to me was huge, because I teach at a public university where sometimes my class has almost 50% of students will be first in family to go to college. And to me, that was my mom, and that was my grandfather and his brothers and sisters back in the 19-teens on my dad's side. But we almost hear no one in academia has been concerned about tuition savings, which just floors me. Like, we need to care about our students' finances. All right, so these data, as Chris mentioned, have had a huge impact. This paper became sort of a phenomenon, and I checked the other day, it's just gone over 6,000 citations. So please, some people are noting in the chat, use this thing. I mean, this is equivalent in my mind to in the US, when the Surgeon General published the meta-analysis in 1964 saying, ladies and gentlemen, smoking is bad for you. This is kind of the message of this paper. So this took me 5 years, 5 months and 12 days. So please, and I hope it helps you out in the work you're doing on your own campus. So the answer to our question is clearly all students benefit. All right, now let's get into the new data. And I'm going to show you stuff that's been published in the last 14 months. So these are papers you may not have been able to track down now. So I'll slow down a little bit and help unpack some, I think, papers that really get to the core of what this conference is about and what I hope a lot of you about, which is making higher education a force for equity. Instead, as Chris put it in the introduction, a gateway instead of a gatekeeper, which is the way it's functioned for almost 1,000 years. Higher education has been for rich kids, and we've got to change that. All right, so just to show you about sort of what are we dealing with here, I want to show you an example we published in Science Advances last spring, about a year ago. And we looked at data from almost 26,000 students, again, on my campus at the University of Washington. We were looking at, we called student groups, minoritized groups in STEM, or MGS, if they come from racial or ethnic groups that are officially recognized by the US National Science Foundation as underrepresented in STEM. So that's African Americans, Hispanics, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, so indigenous folks, the groups you see here, and low income students, regardless of their ethnicity or race. So that's the comparison we're doing here. And we look at how are people doing in general chemistry and organic chemistry. So Gen Chem 1, for those of you in STEM know that this course, at least in the States, is infamous for being brutal on students, and especially, as I'll show you, for minoritized students. I'm going to be showing you over the next couple slides a lot of these graphs are called notch plots, and you may not have seen them before. They're similar to box and whisker plots, if you've seen those. This is the median of the data I'm showing you right here. The notch is the 95% confidence interval. The stems are the range of data, or sorry, the box is the interquartile range, so that's 50% of the data. This is the full range of the data, excluding these dots, which are potential outliers. And remember, this is almost 26,000, drawn from 26,000 data points. These data I'm showing you right now are the achievement gap, the GPA difference for minoritized groups versus non-minoritized groups. So in this case, this is based on race and ethnicity and income again. So I'm going to show you raw data, and then I'm going to show you what I call model data. So the raw data are just that, just what the grades that students get. And the relevance here is that that's what the professional school sees. That's what employers see. That's what the graduate schools see. So it matters a lot to student decisions. So, but we also look at what we call model data. So here we controlled for indices of student preparation and ability. So when you're looking at these notch plots side by side, these are still minoritized groups by race and ethnicity in this case. This data point shows you, okay, if you took a minoritized student, let's say you took a Black or Hispanic student with exactly the same high school GPA and exactly the same SAT college entrance score, and you compared it to a white or Asian American student, this is this gap, right? If they're doing equally well, that's 0. All right, so this is, I know I just went through this really fast, you guys, and you haven't seen data like this before. So let's take a minute or two. What do these data mean to you? And this is several questions at once, so go ahead and I'll try to monitor the chat as best as I can. How big is this gap? How much does it matter? What does it mean? There's still a gap when you've controlled for academic preparation. Someone's asking about gender and LGBTQ students. We've got gender. We've with these data, the only data we had were male, female. We only had binary data. We have no data at all on other gender identities. But I'll show you the male, female data in a second. Yeah, someone just mentioned there's a significant gap for controlling for SAT. So that to me is just devastating. This is circumstances of birth. This is like, I grew up in a poor household. Yeah, I'm not as well prepared. I went to a crappy high school, but the message to me that in these data is don't let your colleagues explain it, blame K through 12. It's not, there's still stuff going on in our classrooms that's really, really punishing minoritized students. All right, you guys just looked at these data. I'm highlighting, this is the same graph, same data you just looked at. I'm adding the binary gender data. So this is the gap for women. This is the gap again for underrepresented minorities. Sorry, that's URM. So again, that's Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander. This is low socioeconomic status, so low income students, either educationally or economically disadvantaged. And then FGN is first generation. So these are first in family to go to college. You know, I still don't get tired of looking at these data. It's just, this to me is fascinating. Someone just said evidence of systematic inequities. Yep. So for example, why, again, for binary gender, the pattern's very different. There's still gaps, but for women, it's not so much about their success in this Gen Chem course is not so much their deficit compared to men is not so much about preparation. Yeah, ooh, that's a depressing graph. Yeah. Man, but it should also be inspiring, you guys. We've got work to do. And it's thousands and thousands of students. I mean, nationally, internationally, hundreds of thousands of students per year. If we can make any progress, the ramifications are enormous. And you can see the gaps. Students are half a grade point behind. And in this course, this department has a fixed median of about 2.6. So that half a grade point lower is putting the average grade for minoritized students at about a C, a 2. So the failure rates are just boggling. All right, and there are consequences. Speaking of depressing, this is an ecologist would call this a survivorship curve. If you start with 100% of the students in the course and just say, okay, how many are left? Sorry, I'm getting my cursor up so you can track it. How many are left after general chemistry 1? Sorry, 1 on a quarter system. So we have quarters, 3 terms of general chemistry 2, then 3, then that's OC is organic chemistry. The next sequence you go to, if you're thinking about a degree in science and engineering or going to medical school or dental school, this is the drop off. Just enormous. And it still exists when you control for preparation and ability. So our classrooms are hostile to women, underrepresented minorities, first generation students. It is, as one student described, it's a foreign land. We've got to make that right. Okay, here's where we stop being depressed. But again, I hope this leads to resolve. Look at these data. When I saw it, I think I actually stood up. It just was eye-popping to me. Now, this is going to be tough, so I'm going to unpack this very slowly. It took me days to figure this out, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. All right, so this is your GPA. This is in General Chemistry 1. Again, that first course, first fall freshman usually. All right, this is, if you got a 1, on so basically a D, C, B, or A, how likely were you to drop the course? That's in blue. This is for minoritized students. So this is women in this case. I'm going to show you all the other groups we track routinely. This is for men. All right. This is your probability of persisting. Yeah, I'm going to go on chemistry based on I got this grade, I got this grade, I got this grade, I got this grade. This is my probability of retaking the course, saying, okay, here I can't go on. I'm below that 1.5 threshold, 1.7 threshold. Here, that's what this dotted line is. You can't go on. Are there questions? I'm going to give you a second. That was really fast. So this is showing you based on how you did in the course, how are you responding? Are you going to persist? Are you going to drop out? Are you going to retake it and try again? If, and you'll see this pattern over and over, but if women do poorly on their first try, it's like, that's it. The door's closed. It's like, yeah, this is a man's world in science. I don't belong here. I'm out. But if women just do okay, a C for most of my students is like the worst grade they've ever gotten in life. We have high school all-stars come to the University of Washington. That's often devastating. But for minoritized groups, I call this the hyper persistent zone. Because if, and look at this pattern, it occurs, it occurs for racial and ethnic minorities, it occurs for low income students. For reasons we don't understand, we didn't see it in first generation, but it's like, if students just do okay, if we can just solve our classrooms, make up some of those gaps, get more students out of that failure zone into just getting a C, like I might be able to do that, they are motivated. And the literature shows they're not motivated by dollar signs, they're motivated by helping their families and the community. Oh, someone asked, are these controlled for SATs? Yes, you get exactly the same pattern when you control for SAT or high school GPA. Yeah, let's just put in major finding, what we need to strive for. This, again, I stood up. I just thought, these are the kids I went to high school with, and I said, God, we've got to give them a chance. And it's not by making courses easier. It's not by restructuring science. It's just by changing the way we teach. We need to change our system. And we can do it. These are the data on the solution now. We've defined the problem. And again, I started with my own course. So when remember when I showed you those 6 quarters of data over whatever it was, 6 years, we showed everybody getting better. A graduate student of mine, or not of mine, he was just in our department, named David Haig, said, Scott, I went to the worst high school in North Carolina. And I said, well, I went to one of the worst high schools in the state of Wisconsin. He said, I went to a lot of students who would be in our institutions. We call it EOP program, Educational Opportunity Program. So that means low income families, often on government financial assistance to get to school, or from really terrible, really super low performing, failing high schools. So David said, how are they doing? So everybody's doing better. That's great. But how are our EOP students doing? So he cut loose with the data, and this is what he found. When I was lecturing, the gaps, so this is 0, this is equity along the horizontal axis, were just boggling. And when I did the low structure, so we got everybody doing better, but the minoritized students weren't benefiting yet, the low income students weren't benefiting yet. But when it went to high structure, when I really did it, instead of sort of dabbling, when I went full on, no lecturing, all active, I'm trying to capture this. My ideal, I still would teach with PowerPoint decks, but ideally all questions. So I make my students figure this stuff out. And when I started doing that, when I really went for this, the gaps went in less than half. And the folks who are following on and picking this up and doing better, way better teachers than I am now in our department, are getting even lower gaps than that, sometimes often eliminating them. Okay, again, that was one course, one university, one student population. What about everybody else, the rest of the world? So we went back to that 2014 data that I summarized for you guys a second ago, and some of you are familiar with, and said, well, who disaggregated data for the groups we usually look at, again, are women, first generation, racial ethnic minorities, or what am I missing? Oh yeah, low income. And here's a really important point that I want you guys to take home from this session. A lot of people didn't know. And since then, I've been told by people at this is on the US side, some extremely prestigious universities, they say, my university doesn't want to know. I can't get the data broken down by binary gender even, or by race or ethnicity or family income level. They don't want to know what's going on, but we've got to you can be the advocates on your campus. We've got to dig in and see what's happening. It's just too important to ignore. That's this little note at the bottom about less than 14% is, we've got to do it. So we were able to dig out, and then we looked at more recent papers. We sent out a ton of notices to people who work in this area asking for any unpublished data we had. Again, this is a meta-analysis where you just really shake the bushes for any data points on this question of achievement gaps now for minoritized groups based on, again, lecturing or any kind of active learning. So again, we looked at exam scores and passing rates. We were able to find decent numbers for exam scores, even better numbers for groups that had data on usually it's DFW, W being withdrawal, DFW rates, failure rates in general. For those of you who are technically inclined, I want to introduce you to Ellie Theobald, who used a lot of new techniques in this paper that are really exciting. And again, this is published about almost exactly a year ago, last March. And here are the data. So this is, I'm going to show you exam scores and then passing rates. You're going to see a series of graphs like this. This is under lecturing, what the gaps look like on average. And here we're combining the data we were disaggregating were students who are either low income or racial and ethnic minorities. So we're looking at those two groups as the minoritized groups in STEM. So when we looked at how students were doing under active learning in the same course, usually almost always with the same instructor, that gap shrunk a lot in exam scores, even more in failure rates. So those are the reductions that happened. And just a quick point, let's keep going. We've got a couple important things to do. All right, one of the important points is this isn't a magic bullet. Like anything else, you can do it badly, as I'm sure some of you are painfully aware from perhaps watching colleagues or doing teaching workshops. This is from the 2014 paper, so this is overall students. That's at 12% failure rate, if you remember. What's going on here in this tail? Now, someone just typed in poor implementation. That's right. I remind people you can kill yourself with water. You can kill yourself with aspirin. So you can do active learning badly. You can harm your students. We found the same pattern with the gap data. We found active learning interventions that exacerbated gaps. On average, we got great reduction. So that's again, use this paper on your campuses. Use it with your chairs, use it with your deans, use it with your colleagues, but remind people, you guys, we've got to get this right. There's evidence, there's literature. I'm a
Hi, everyone. Just jumping in. Unless I'm the only one, I think Scott is frozen. There must be a technical issue. JF, are you listening?
Yeah, I think he's having network issues. He should come back soon. So yeah, he was disconnected. We'll come back in a second.
Okay. While that is going on, just stunning. My gosh, the discussion in the chat, I think, is reflecting this. But you know, if the 2014 paper was a mic drop moment, the 2020 paper was the whole building coming down. Right? We just, the message that I get from this is that what we do is crucially important, and we can have an impact on making changes, and the changes, you know, at the middle upper end are important, but at the bottom, it's just so important that we do this. So, Maybe we can have a quick, I'm not sure what to do here.
I'm going to reach out and try to find Scott on
Okay.
just regular. But maybe one of the things is we'll extend the time for the keynote, not to go into the sessions, but to give him a time to talk. And then for those who weren't planning on going to another session right after, maybe we can have some Q&A. But hopefully he'll get back soon.
Yeah. Maybe while we're waiting, people can use the chat, or there's one question in the Q&A. And again, the Q&A is for questions towards the end that we can ask Scott. But maybe if you've got any questions that you're mulling about what Scott has shown us so far, please put that into the Q&A. Interesting point in the chat about how come when I present the 2014 paper results to lecturing colleagues, they say, oh, interesting, and they go back to lecturing. Oh, there you are.
I'm back, you guys. I'm sorry, I live in a rural area and we just had a power outage, but it's back on.
That's okay. We were treading water as we were waiting.
You're fantastic. Talk about thinking on your feet. Leave it to a good teacher, right, to deal with anything that comes up.
Yeah, we have to adapt. So Liz has said that we can extend the time a little bit, Scott, so that yeah, there are some sessions afterwards, but I think we're in a position where we can keep going if you want to finish up, because it felt like you were sort of building towards a crescendo ending. So let's not stop that. And then again, anyone who can't stay with us, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording very soon. But yes, so Scott, if you can keep going, and then we'll manage questions at the end.
Great. Thanks so much for your patience. Thanks so much for your patience, everybody. Okay, so you can see the screen and the data. So the next data I wanted to show you is, again, on this gaps analysis from the meta-analysis that published about a year ago. Again, this is exam score data, passing rate data. This is a pattern that jumped out at us and we think is extremely important for you guys to use. And maybe if we have time with questions, you can generate some ideas about how to cope with this, especially some folks, I know some of you do a lot of professional development work. So look at, this is low intensity. This data was really sketchy, but we were able to partition the active learning instances to, if they had data on what percentage of class time are the students actually engaged in solving working problems or doing something active. And so we were able to bin into low and high as defined up here on the upper left. And these are the results. So with failure rates, for example, I'm going to highlight this. Here's the key thing, especially for those of you who do workshops. If you do a little bit of active learning, you might not see any benefit. And you remember that's what I saw when I did that work back that was published in 2011. So the discouraging thing is, I mean, what you've got to be aware is you have to start small, especially to do things right. So start small. Don't expect a lot of response right away, but keep going until you're at this high intensity threshold and your students are really working, your problems are well scaffolded, well framed, you learned how to provide feedback efficiently, and you'll see on average extremely encouraging. I mean, we're really close to eliminating achievement gaps, at least in failure rates right here. And remember, active learning is still, I mean, reasonably new, and we're just getting started. We can blow this thing out of the water as a community. Okay, very quickly, the next thing we're working on is why this is working. We're trying to disrupt inequities. this is our current hypothesis. We call it heads and hearts. So the first component we think is going on is an active learning environment, as opposed to lecture, provides deliberate practice. So these are the components of deliberate practice, and deliberate practice is hard. Your job is to make your students uncomfortable. Your job is to push them. It's just like music, like doing scales, learning how to do a new technique on violin or piano. It's not fun, but you get better. That's how you get better. Same thing in sports. Like, you do wind sprints until you're ready to throw up, but you do them and you get in shape. Same thing's going on for students who come from low income backgrounds. Like, I went to a crummy high school. I've never had that chance before. University is awesome. This is my chance for deliberate practice, and I get a huge disproportionate benefit. And likewise, the hearts part is that this is what I hope you guys are really good at, or working at intensively, is creating a culture of inclusion in your background, in your classroom. All right, so these are what we call your soft skills. Can you communicate that you are honestly interested in your students' success, and you are willing to work for them to make sure they can be successful and do the best of their ability? So you're the one who's demonstrating to you, not talking, but demonstrating to your students that they belong here, that they can succeed, that they belong in science, or as a historian, or as a journalist, whatever your field is. We think these are the two things going on based on hints in the literature. We have a major project going on over the next 5 years to try to nail this. So that's the current piece of work that I and colleagues are working on. Just to wrap up, so we need to test this. We need to see if these patterns, the data I showed you in STEM, are extending to other disciplines in the academy. And this is, to me, is a $64,000 question, is, all right, if you bring equity to your classroom and low-income students are succeeding, so their kids can start going to university, and we can reduce social and economic inequities across society, does that matter to my institution and my department and my colleagues? Do I get, is that criteria for merit pay increase? And is that who we're hiring? Is that who we're promoting? Because right now the system is not set up to reward good teaching, and that has to change. People talk about systemic racism. That's our system, and it's our system as university educators. All right, so your work is important, you guys. I'm so glad you're here at SALTISE investing in this work, and keep the faith. We can do this if we have the resolve. There's the past, there's the present. Funding sources I need to thank. The meta-analysis work was unfunded, so I always have to give credit to caffeine and plastic. All right, with that, I'll stop sharing, and Chris, you can dial up questions.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. That was really quite something. While you were managing the power outage, the analogy, or the image that came to mind was, if that 2014 paper was the mic drop, then the 2020 work that you and your colleagues did is almost, the whole building coming down. It's just so dramatic that, that we need to change the institution of education, and improving success rates or improving exam scores is one thing, but the impacts that reducing these gaps, these inequity gaps within education, just have such a huge potential for improving everything in society. So I think that's I really enjoyed. It was depressing to see some of the graphs and the data, but it's
I think now
invigorating to think
frozen.
that active learning. I am frozen?
No, you froze for a moment.
Oh, did I? Okay. Sorry about that. So there are a couple of questions, Scott, that came up in the Q&A. There was one from the beginning about LGBTQ plus students and the data. You addressed that a little bit, but maybe you could touch on that. Then there were a couple more specific ones about the hearts component and the why question. Do you want to address the, I mean, the LGBTQ plus question touches on this issue of data and how do we, we need as institutions to collect good data to be used for good purposes. How do we do that? Any thoughts on that?
So yeah, my read on the literature is that it's almost completely unstudied. I would look to, if you're interested in, I would look to Sarah Brownell at Arizona State University, has been working on this some, and she's been very concerned. She actually did a postdoc with our group and is just doing some brilliant work. And she's really concerned about just inclusion, that if students have non-normative gender identities, are they feeling included? Are they feeling accepted in the classroom? That's going to be even bigger issues for folks from the LGBTQ plus community. So Sarah's been pushing that theme. My take as a researcher would be, we should start with qualitative data, start talking to students and listening to students and looking at, I mean, Sarah's concerned that an active learning classroom is actually more threatening to students with non-traditional gender identities. And so, that could be an enormous issue that we need to address as a community. So I would, number one, I would not worry about collecting numbers right now at all, but just sit and listen to students and say, okay, as instructors, the evidence says we've got to teach this way. How can we make this work for everybody?
Good. Other questions in the Q&A? Let's see. Does the hearts component of the why question include an element of combating imposter syndrome, i.e. seeing their peers struggle as they do combats the narrative that they are inherently bad at the subject, yeah, and that no one else is struggling as they are? Yeah,
yeah, so really good stuff. Imposter syndrome is huge, and it again touches on this belonging issue that's just at the heart of a lot of student success. Self-belief. If you guys are familiar with the literature on sort of psychosocial interventions, psycho-emotional interventions that have been pioneered by people like Carol Dweck and Walton Cohen, there's a series of researchers in psychology who have done a lot of pioneering work. There's a Walton and Cohen paper that addresses exactly belonging and imposter syndrome, and it's an intervention that was used. They used it at scale with first fall freshmen. About it was a series of workshops or written material and some workshop material, but basically they had students, experienced students who were students of BIPOC students or gender non-normative students who would give testimonials and say, oh yeah, when I first came here, when I arrived at McGill or Concordia or wherever, I felt completely like no one looked like me. I felt lost. I didn't know what I was doing here. And then I realized everybody else was struggling, or finally I did okay, or an instructor took, but basically telling that story that you can get through this, that everybody experiences this sense of adjustment to college. It's just adjustment to a new environment. They have some really powerful data sets coming out of interventions like that. But again, how do we scale that? How do we make it work for all of our students is work that we need to do together.
Right. Agreed. So I'll ask one more question and then we'll wrap up. Again, thanks everyone for sticking around. So Ian McKenzie asks, Scott, are you aware of groups or of people or groups doing similar work establishing impacts of active learning in relation to equity in the social sciences and or the humanities?
Short answer is no. Well, I'm sorry, for social sciences, yes, there's some, not so much on disaggregated data and inequities. there's some good active learning papers that have come out of economics and few out of political science, but it's in general wildly understudied. I'm not sure aware of anyone who has disaggregated data and looked at minoritized groups. So it's an issue, and kind of the irony here is that I mean, sociologists and psychologists sociologists are incredible data analysts. I mean, we use a lot of techniques straight out of quantitative sociology, and the cognitive psych, developmental psych people are the best experimentalists best papers I've ever read. So it's ironic that some of the social sciences are understudied. So again, a lot of good work to do.
Great. So I'll take this opportunity then to thank you very much for your time, Scott. Thank you for sharing your message. Thank you for going through Stats Canada data to bring us a Canadian picture of some of this at the beginning. Appreciate your time very much. Thank you for the message. And I think, to me, the take home from this is, now that we know what kind of an impact active learning can have, how do we make it happen? Because knowing that it does something and then being able to have teachers consistently and sustainably develop and their active learning pedagogies and use them in class, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So our job, and I think that's what this community of practice model for SALTISE is all about, helping each other develop the resources and the expertise to build this capacity to do active learning effectively across all of our institutions. So that's the challenge ahead of us. So thank you very much, Scott. Pleasure having you here. We thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.